Does God exist? The ontological argument says yes, and uses a priori deductive reasoning that comes from the concept of God to establishing the existence of God. What that means is that the argument is made based on the definition of God rather than what we see in the world, such as the problem of evil or the beauty of nature. In this video, we'll unravel the core ideas of the ontological argument and confront the thought-provoking criticisms that surround this extraordinary argument. So, get ready to unravel the secrets to the question that's on everyone's mind. Does God really exist? The ontological argument is a special deductive way of proving that God exists. It's a logical puzzle that starts with the concept of God and doesn't need any real-life experience. We call it ontological because that comes from the Latin word ontos, meaning existence. So let's explore how this argument connects the dots and reveals the existence of God, all without needing evidence from our senses. We'll also explore some of the criticisms to this argument along the way. It all started in the 11th century with a clever Italian monk named Saint Anselm, or at least he was the first to have been attributed to have laid out the ontological argument formally in his proslogion. Saint Anselm starts his argument by defining God as something than which nothing greater can be thought, and that this definition of God can be understood in the mind by everybody, regardless of whether or not they believe in God, even by a fool. He then identifies that things can exist in intellectu, in the mind, and in re, in reality. It is greater to exist both in intellectu and in re than in intellectu alone. For example, it's greater for a painter to have painted a painting that he envisioned in reality than it is for the painter to simply just imagine the painting. If God were to exist in the mind alone, he would not be something than which nothing greater can be thought. And so God must exist in both in intellectu and in re. God must exist not just in our thoughts, but also in reality. One of the critics, Gaunilo, used an analogy called the Lost Island to challenge Anselm's argument. Gaunilo was an empiricist who thought that human intellect is only able to comprehend information provided by the senses, and contends that St. Anselm's ontological argument fails in his work on behalf of the fool. He argues that logic of the same kind would force one to conclude that many things exist, which certainly do not. He employed the same reasoning via reductio ad absurdum to prove the existence of the mythical Lost Island. He argues that the Lost Island is that island than which no greater can be conceived. It is greater for it to exist in reality than merely as an idea. If the Lost Island does not exist, one can conceive of an even greater island, that is one that does exist. Therefore, the Lost Island exists in reality. This conclusion highlights the same far-fetched nature of the conclusion which Anselm puts forward. In his Meditations, Descartes maintains that God's existence is ultimately known through intuition, a priori. He begins from the position of radical skepticism, from which he concludes cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. In the fifth mediation, Descartes puts forward a third argument for the existence of God, known as his ontological argument, of which there are two versions. Version A states that whatever one clearly and distinctly perceives to be contained in the idea of something is true of that thing. One clearly and distinctly perceives that necessary existence is contained in the idea of God. Therefore, God exists. Version B states that one has an idea of a supremely perfect being, a being having of all perfections. Necessary existence is a perfection. Therefore, a supremely perfect being exists. Descartes completes his arguments by using a set of analogies, such as the nature of a triangle and the necessary relationship between a mountain and a valley, to prove that the nature of a substance cannot be separated from the substance itself. For example, a triangle cannot be separated from the nature of itself, which is having three sides. And so both nature and substance are mutually dependent, just as God exists because he relies on his existence to maintain his perfection. But Immanuel Kant raised a very interesting criticism. He argued that denying the existence of God is not inherently contradictory, and existence is not something that adds to the essence of a thing. This challenges the very basis of of the ontological argument. Bertrand Russell focused on the term existence and criticized the argument based on it. He pointed out that existence refers to things within the world of space and time, while the concept of God is often seen as beyond these limitations. Russell also emphasized that the structure of an argument alone does not prove the existence of something, highlighting that the ontological argument's deductive a priori structure doesn't necessarily prove God's existence. In more recent times, philosophers like Norman Malcolm and Alvin Plantiga have proposed their own versions of the ontological argument to counter these criticisms. Malcolm's version states that God's existence is either necessary or impossible. He argues that if the concept of God doesn't contain contradictions, then God's existence is not impossible, which means it must be necessary. Plantiga, on the other hand, argues that a being with maximal greatness, possessing qualities like being all-knowing, all-powerful, and supremely good, must exist in at least one possible world. Therefore, a being of true greatness, which we can equate with God, exists in our actual world. So, the ontological argument offers a unique way to prove that God exists by using logic and thinking about what God actually is. Even though it has been criticized, philosophers have come up with different answers and updated versions to show that it's still valid. The ontological argument keeps making people think and talk about how we exist and what God means. What are your thoughts on the ontological argument? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again next time.